Long ago in Kazakhstan, a shepherd and a farmer lived in adjoining lands. Now, they lived there all their lives, and they loved each other well. Their families were close. It was as though they were related by blood. The farmer's land was lush and green. The shepherd's land was rocky, but still there was a sweet grass that grew between the rocks, and so the sheep were round and happy. Until one spring, a fever swept through the flock and all of the sheep perished. The shepherd did not know what to do. This land was not farmable. At last he came to his friend, the farmer, and said, "There is no way for my family to make a living any longer here, and so we bid goodbye to you and leave our love with you as we go to the city to beg." And the farmer said, "No, no, my brother, do not leave. Share half of my land. Farm it until you've made enough money to buy another flock. And then when you have a herd of sheep again, you can go back to the living that you were used to." And so that's what happened. The farmer gave over half the land and the shepherd began to farm. But one day he dug from the ground something heavy. When he struck his shovel against it, he wasn't sure what it was, but in time he found it was an earthenware jar. It was heavy, and he lifted it out of the ground and unstopped it and saw that it was filled to the top with gold coins. Immediately he carried it to his friend, his brother, the farmer, and said, "Look what I have found on your land. This treasure belongs to you." And when the farmer looked inside, he was quite astonished. He said, "No, no, this treasure, you dug it up. It belongs to you." "No," said the shepherd. "No," said the farmer. It was the first time they had ever argued. So at last, since they could not decide who should keep the great earthenware jar of coins, they decided to take their problem to the wise man, the judge in their town. And so they carried the earthenware jar, and they found the judge sitting underneath his teaching tree. At his back was a field that he owned, and before him were 4 students listening upon every word he spoke. When the farmer and the shepherd revealed the problem, the argument between them, the wise man listened and said, "Let us ask my students what they think." And he turned to the first and said, "How would you resolve this argument?" Well, the first student said, "These two have never argued before. Everyone knows they have been friends all their lives. And they are arguing over something dug out of the earth. They should bury it again and go back to being friends." "Ah," said the wise man. And then he turned to the second student. He said, "What do you think?" "Well, I think that you are the judge and you should be paid for making decisions, so they should give you the money. That's how you should settle the matter." "Ah," said the wise man. He turned to the third student, who said, "Well, I believe that everything we own belongs to the Khan, so they should take the earthenware jar into the city and give it over to the ruler of our nation." "Ah," said the wise man. And then he turned to the fourth student. "And what would you do?" "Well," said the young man, "I have always dreamed of creating a magic garden for the poor that would have clear water running through it to feed their thirst, and thick grass on the ground like a cushion or a bed or a rug. There would be flowers there so fragrant that they would feed the soul, and trees growing bearing fruit that would feed the body. If I had such a treasure, that's how I would use it." "Yes," said the wise man, the judge. "If these two agree, then I believe we should give you the coins and have you go to the city and buy seeds. I will give you this field behind us, and you can plant it, and in time you will have a garden for the poor." Well, the farmer and the shepherd happily agreed, and somewhat astonished, the young man lifted up the crock and carried it toward the city. Now, he'd never been there before, and he was amazed at the smells and the sights and the sounds. Before he even got to the marketplace, though, he saw a caravan passing by, and on the back of each of the camels were strapped bird cages, and on the sides of the camel saddle birds were tied by their feet with little nooses so that they lay against the camel's side. And with each step that the camel took, the birds would thwack against the side of the animal. Their cries were so pitiful, they sounded like broken parts of their song. The young man, seeing this, said, "Stop!" to the camel driver. The camel driver looked at him and said, "Why would I stop?" "Well, where are you going?" asked the young man. "Why, I'm taking these birds to sell them to the Khan. I imagine he will eat some and he will cage some and he will give the feathers to the women in his household." "No, you can't do that. You have to set them free." "And why would I do that?" said the caravan driver. "Are you going to pay me money to do that?" "Why, yes, I am," said the student. And he lifted up the earthenware jar, and when the man opened it, he saw that there was as much gold, maybe more than he could have expected to get from the Khan. And he said, "Sold! You may have all the birds." And with that, he took his knife and he cut whatever leather pieces kept the cages on the camel's back or kept the noosed birds there at its side. And he left the young man with the birds, and he took the earthenware jar and continued on into the city's marketplace. Now the young man gathered up the cages and he gathered up the birds and he set out to the edge of town, and there he untied everything that held the feet of the birds together so that they could stand on their feet, and he opened every one of the cages so that the birds could come to the edge, and he ran to a stream and he brought water and he held it close so that they could all sip from it. And then one by one the birds all shook themselves and they took off and flew away into the sky. And oh, what a sight it was to see so many beautiful birds flying free, and then they were gone. And that's when the young man remembered that he had been sent to the city to buy seeds for his garden, and he bought the birds instead, and now the birds were gone. He had nothing to show. And he felt like a fool. Still, he turned and he began to walk back towards his village. He came at last to the field that he'd been given, and there he fell to his knees and he wept. But when he opened his eyes, he saw that he was surrounded on every side by birds that spoke to him, saying, "We've heard about you. Our mothers and fathers, our brothers and sisters, our cousins and aunts and uncles, our grandparents have all told us what you did, how you freed so many of our race, and we are here to help you now." And so the birds began to jump about and pat the ground and scratch it with their claws. The biggest of the birds used their beaks to draw a trench through the field, and a spring bubbled up at one end. And so cold, clean water ran through the field. And then the birds all took off flying in every direction, and coming back with seeds of all kinds, they dropped them into the holes that they had made with their beaks and with their feet. And then the biggest of the birds stood at the edge of the field and fanned it with their wings and blew upon it with their warm, moist breath. And grass began to grow in the field, and flowers began to blossom, and trees rose up, and these leafed out, and then they flowered, and then they bore fruit, so that by magic, there before the student was the garden he had always envisioned for the poor. But he wasn't the only one to see it, and word began to spread, and those who had much and wanted more came on horseback and camel, coming to the garden to claim what grew within it. But as they drew close, stone walls rose out of the ground on four sides, and in the middle of one of the walls there was an iron gate. And when the rich men grew near with their greed on their faces, The gates closed and locked themselves with 7 locks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. One man felt so entitled that he brought his camel up to the wall and he stood on its back and he reached to grab some fruit from one of the trees, but his camel stumbled and he fell. And he got up limping and led his camel away. And at last all of those men who had much and wanted more went away. And then those who had little or nothing began to come from every side, having heard of the garden. And the gate, it unlocked itself, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it opened wide. And the people came inside and they saw that the grass was like a carpet or a bed, and the water was sweet and clear, and the flowers were so fragrant that they eased and they fed the soul, and the fruit from the trees was all they needed to feed their bodies. And when the day came to an end, those who had homes went home, and those who had nowhere to go lay down upon the carpet of grass, and the gates closed again and locked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 locks. But in morning, at the dawn, the locks opened again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the garden for the poor came to be because of the dreams and the heart of one man.